Hi, and welcome to another episode of KammaKast, the video cast where we speak to interesting people from around the fintech, financial services and kind of real estate industries. And today we're lucky enough to have Andrew Knight from RICS with us. Thanks for joining us, Andrew. How are
Pleasure.
you today?
I'm very well, very well. Enjoying the fact that it's not too hot.
Yes, a slightly more literally chilled start to the week than last week, which I am extremely grateful about. Which does actually bring me neatly onto the subject that we're going to chat about today, which is, of course,
Indeed.
climate change. I'm really interested to hear Rick's perspective on all these things. So, because I guess we come at this from the perspective that the built environment contributes 40% of all greenhouse gas emissions across the world. And it is essentially the hardest problem to tackle. As I always give the example, it's, where cars are considered, you can draw a line in the sand and say, okay, you're not allowed manufacture any kind of fossil fueled cars as of 2035. Whereas it's a lot more complicated when it comes to the built environment. Most of our housing stock is, I believe, only 0.3% of our housing stock is net zero ready. So there's this huge mountain to climb, and it's a difficult, big, and costly question. I believe 48.3 billion is the cost to retrofit the UK to get us to an EPCC, which is kind of this level which kind of government seems to be benchmarking as acceptable. I'd love to hear what the perspectives from RICS is or as a representative of surveyors and what these challenges are going to be and how we're starting to look at tackling them.
Indeed. Well, I mean, it's clearly a huge priority for RICS as a professional body. And in fact, our most recent review carried out by Lord Michael Bishard really highlighted how important sustainability is an issue as a thread running through everything we do and everything the profession does. So from that point of view, we're 100% recognizing that the built environment sector is currently that huge contributor to emissions, not only through the construction phase in terms of embodied carbon, but obviously that operational phase as well. And as you say, for a sector that is particularly fragmented, arguably not the most productive and necessarily the most advanced in terms of use of technology or use of data, it's a big challenge when that sector is also very fragmented. There's so many actors involved, and you obviously mentioned in the UK the challenge of residential retrofit, but we're also looking at the challenges around commercial property. And although that's arguably a smaller, asset class in money terms compared to residential, it's still a considerable impact in terms of, as I say, both embodied and operational carbon and the links to value and all those issues around how we actually not only recognize the problem, but I think more challengingly, how do we actually fix it? Because there is this danger of admiring the problem. But from our perspective, we're very much focused on it now. As an example, we're working on the UK Net Zero Carbon Building Standard with other bodies like BBP, BRE, Carbon Trust, CIBSE, iStruckE, REBA, UK Green Building Council. So there's a lot of activity to set the appropriate standards, because I think one of the challenges is simply measuring. We need to measure and understand
Yeah.
the different options at design phase, at construction phase, at operational phase. Where do we get the materials from? What materials do we use? What are the implications in terms of embodied carbon at that point? And then over that full life cycle, what are the implications for the operational carbon side as well? And historically, if I think of one sector of our profession, obviously, quantity surveying and cost managers, very much focused on cost from a construction perspective, but now having to think very clearly about what's that life cycle cost, what's that cost over the full cycle, and then what's the carbon and the emissions over that life cycle. Once again, both looking at embodied and operational. So I think there is a step change taking place. Some of it, I think, is driven in a good way by the capital markets. When you think about commercial real estate and their focus on ESG and their understanding of the damage to their portfolios by a kind of a brown discount. But then there's almost that much bigger problem at a sort of societal level, if we look at the UK, but residential building stock, where, as you said, it's an eye-watering number when you think of the cost of getting 15 million homes up to EPCC. It's an eye-watering amount of money, and even though arguably now the savings to households are probably an order of magnitude bigger, given the huge prices increases we've seen on electricity and gas, for many people, for most people, the cost of retrofitting without some kind of government help or other kind of financing is prohibitive for many people. When you're talking 10, 20, 30,000 pounds to retrofit a house, it's a significant amount of money. So we're very focused on standards around how to measure and understand the kind of design choices and how to measure and project emissions over the life of property, but also skilling up our workforce, our profession, to make sure they understand all the issues around how to retrofit, because we can't simply knock everything down and rebuild. And there are huge impacts indeed of demolition, which produces a huge amount of waste as well. So huge challenges, but I suppose the good news is we're very aware and we're doing a lot of activity to skill up the profession and understand how can we be part of the solution.
Thanks for that overview, Andrew. So interesting when you kind of tend to think of net zero in these broad terms, and it's so all encompassing. And actually, just listening to you there, I understand that like it's so far reaching, the complexities, even down to how the role of a surveyor, how you conduct a survey going forward is going to have to encompass so much more. And as you say, there is a big level of upskilling required once you kind of get to a place where we're able to measure and we know what these standards are as well. So absolutely fascinating. Do you think, I guess you're at this kind of quite exciting place, and it is great to see standards being set. So, this year we've had the task force for climate related financial disclosures become mandatory for listed companies and financial institutions. Here in the UK, it's since April 2022, and I know all G7 countries have adopted them. And we have IFRS bringing in their own climate standards for reporting and financial statements. And now RICS will be bringing out their standards as well. What part, because it's kind of no mean feat to set these standards, particularly where building, and we've just heard how complex it is. What role do you feel data has to play in what you're doing at the moment in trying to come up with these standards?
Well, I mean, it's obviously a critical role because once again, I think it's fair to comment that the property and real estate industry has not been terribly forward-looking in the past in terms of assembling good, structured, quality, trusted data about their assets. And I think one of the things you see now is, if we think of commercial real estate, people now kind of really waking up to the fact that they don't know enough about the assets they have, down to some quite prosaic things of, well, okay, not only how much of the electricity bills and who pays them and occupier versus asset owner, but how big are the buildings, how many stories has it got, and actually understanding the intensity of usage. So I think it's been a real wake-up call to the fact that actually, to use the cliched phrase, you can't manage what you don't measure. So from that point of view, we really do have to get down into the weeds of actually measuring, understanding, yes, the emissions, but understanding the nature of the assets themselves. What are they made of? What are the options around retrofitting, for example? And I think people are really beginning to realise now that this lack of trusted, structured data on real estate, whether it's residential or commercial, is a real barrier. And I think that's where surveyors, who are very much at that kind of sharp, prosaic end of the asset type, as building surveyors or quantity surveyors, running buildings, have a key role here in terms of making sure we can assemble these data sets at any part of the property life cycle. Because it's worth, I think perhaps for our listeners, worth reinstating the fact that our ICS profession works right across the life cycle. They're not just there at the construction stage. They're there working with architects during the early initiation. They're there during the planning and development side. They're there during operations, valuation, brokerage. So they've got a key role right to end of life to understand how best to manage these assets, how best to design, how best to retrofit, how best to maintain and operate to minimise this. But we need better data, and we need more of it. Huge amounts of the property assets we really have very little data on it in those terms.
Yeah, absolutely. I guess that's one of the kind of gaps that Kamma spotted, that we've kind of jumped to fill, in terms of, I guess, buildings just haven't been collecting their own data for long enough, particularly if we think about commercial. And then of course, where residential is concerned, people don't generally collect data about their own homes. So there is there is a big gap that we've kind of jumped to fill. But I think this is something that, even we see a lot of companies talking and trying to encourage people to adopt smart meters and kind of be more aware of what items in their house are consuming energy where. I know where commercial property is concerned, there's obviously huge cost implications to being able to do that. So the incentive is already there to kind of put in that technology and start collecting. But we're very much at the beginning of the journey with all of this. How are you finding engagement with the industry is? Do you feel like there's a lot more that needs to be done to make building operators? I know there's a huge kind of educational piece for consumers, but when we think about kind of commercial asset managers and surveyors themselves, do you think there is a lot more educational resource needs to go into building more awareness around the need to do this?
I think to an extent, yes. I mean, I think that there is already a lot more awareness, and I think people are increasingly looking to see how can they begin that journey of collecting data. And I think one of the challenges, an obvious statement to make, is that the majority of buildings aren't new. People can get excited by the thought of smart buildings and the Internet of Things and all these kind of sensors, but the majority of what we'll need to do is retrofitting these kinds of technology onto existing building stock, and making a very sensible decision about what to prioritize, what kind of data to collect in the short term. And some of it is around even things like green leases and just making the exchange of data between occupiers and landlords clearer in terms of what the intensity of a building is. But I think people are very much awake to this now and understand that they need to start collecting data. It's just we don't necessarily start from a very good place, unfortunately. So there's a lot to do. But I think the awareness is we will continue to need to educate, but there will be these drivers both in terms of minimum energy levels for kind of renting and leasing that will be the kind of stick, if I can use that phrase, but also just the mere fact that market signals will begin to send very strong value signals, particularly in the commercial space, about the quality of assets, where it's either a green premium or a brown discount, or in an extreme case, a stranded asset. And certainly talking to a number of asset managers in the City of London, they're very aware that they will have to now budget, I think, to spend more money from that top line rental income on the kind of ongoing retrofit maintenance, adaptation of their assets to make sure that they, not only from an altruistic point of view, are sustainable, but also from a rental and capital value, maintain their value. So I think there's a real understanding now that money will have to be invested to either retrofit or keep assets performing at the right kind of level, certainly in that commercial sector. I think the bigger challenge is how do we fund, either through green loans or combinations of grants or by targeting people who can self-finance, how do we get homeowners and perhaps people who are running a small portfolio of buy to rent, how do we incentivize them and help them financially retrofit this huge number, this 15 million or so homes that need to get up to EPCC?
Yeah, that's they're really good points as well, because I know both you and I are members or representing members for organizations for the Green Finance Institute who have a wonderful mission around, I guess, stimulating private sector kind of investment into green, with I guess, the thought behind it being that it is a virtuous circle, that by investing in green, you're actually future proofing things against transition risk, and that's where investors and the private flow of money wants to go. But I think you're right, it does need to be a kind of a joint private and public sector effort. There is enough collateral. Property is the biggest asset class in the world. There's enough collateral for all this retrofit, even though it's a huge number, there is enough collateral to fund that. But I think it cannot be down to just private sector alone. So I think we do need to see some sort of government stimulus forthcoming like pretty soon, given the kind of timelines that we're working to as well. Do you have any thoughts about what the kind of some of the most helpful things that could be brought forward around that could be?
Yes, I mean, as you say, it's a huge challenge, and I think, as you say, one of the challenges is perhaps the kind of the skewed nature of that capital value, because for many people who would benefit most from having their kind of retrofit done to their property, where they are undoubtedly already struggling with energy prices, will be people who perhaps don't have that much equity. When you look at the kind of the figure that's often quoted of around kind of £30,000 to retrofit an average home in the UK, for many mortgage payers, that represents all the equity they have at the moment. So you've got that kind of unequal distribution of perhaps where the equity sits as to the people who really need that help. So I think, whilst it's easy to spend taxpayers' money, there has to be some considerable, I think, focus from the government on making funds available coupled with incentivizing private sector lenders to make sure that they can extend mortgages, either in terms of extending the length or some other way of making it easier for people to get that kind of green finance product. But as well as the sheer scale of the money involved, I think one also has to highlight the kind of supply chain constraints in terms of enough skilled people to do the work, and indeed enough materials, heat pumps, whatever the solution might be in addition to the fabric, that we don't really have a supply chain in place to actually do this amount of work. So there's training, there's education from a kind of trade perspective, there's understanding the supply chain in terms of materials, both insulation materials and heating systems that would need to be made available in fairly quick order. And it's perhaps interesting to ponder whether there may be a first mover advantage and some lessons we could learn perhaps from the social housing sector, where they often have a direct employed labour force, and where perhaps from a funding perspective there may be an opportunity there to start this process at scale and perhaps learn from these social housing providers how to retrofit at scale. I think on a data side, I'm optimistic that there's a lot of activity, particularly with kind of thermal surveys at scale using satellites, when we can begin to now target areas where there's clearly a lot of properties that are quite literally leaking heat. So I think the data side will have some real step changes in availability and the ability perhaps for local authorities to target particular areas where they can see a lot of properties that are really not performing well, whilst we're still left with the problem that you still need to survey individual properties and understand what the right retrofit sort of passport retrofit options are for them. As I say, it's multiple things that we need to look at: finance, supply chain, availability of data, the various incentives, and as I say, some element of carrot and stick in terms of forcing some people perhaps who can afford to do this to make that investment.
Yeah, and certainly I guess we're seeing that with the private rented sector, where, well, we're waiting for a date to be kind of put in stone around where the minimum energy efficiency standard has to be met. But I do think, albeit I'm sure landlords aren't too delighted about it, I do think these are kind of the way, like there has to be some sort of stick as well as carrot, but it does have to be both. Really interesting point about the social sector, because they are actually a lot greener than the private rented sector. And I think coming back to the data point, you're right that they have access to the information around their own stock. So they know how to target the biggest offenders first. And I guess there also has been funding made available to the social housing sector. So there's been two or three decarbonisation funds made available. I'm sure they're not near enough money to tackle the entire problem, but the point is, I guess these incentives have been around for longer and they have been administered properly. We did an interesting study on fuel poverty where we looked at the 9.1 billion energy bill rebate, where the government kind of gave everybody back £100 towards their bills, which is really nice to get, but really doesn't solve any kind of problem for us at all. And we looked at if that money could have been, we looked at the data, and this is why data can be so powerful. And we were able to work out that had that 9.1 billion been targeted at the most deprived homes, retrofitting them, it could have saved 2.3 million households from going into fuel poverty. And the shocking statistic is about 12 million households are going to go into fuel poverty as a result of the increase in fuel prices. So just looking at data on like both a micro and macro level and can lead to so much better decision making. And we might not have every single data point possible to answer every question ever, but there is still a lot of data out there that can help make inform better decisions and hopefully increase the rate of decision making around this, because the clock is ticking.
Indeed, and I think when we talk about data, I think there's always a danger in sort of perhaps falling into the trap of letting perfection be the enemy of the good, because actually, as you say, if you can really kind of get data at scale to highlight where you need to prioritize and where, as you say, you can really, from a kind of societal perspective, make the biggest gains in terms of taking people out of fuel poverty, finding the properties that really are performing worst. It's not perfection, but the problem is so huge and so urgent, we have to start. And if data, as I say, whether it's from thermal imaging, from satellites, can give you that view very quickly at scale, I think it can help. And I think this is where it has to be kind of slightly bottom up, where I think hopefully local authorities and regions can be given the kind of ammunition in terms of finance and technical support to make these judgments and understanding and really address it, because this is as much a societal impact as well as a planetary one. And I guess one other point I think that's perhaps worth making here is that, and yet it adds more complexity and challenge, is that we're sitting here discussing fuel poverty and houses that leak heat in the winter and are cold. But the danger is that we end up with houses that don't work in the summer for these increasingly hot summers. So I think there's this real role now to think about how are we equipping buildings, and it's perhaps an easier question obviously for new build, but once again, when we retrofit, are we thinking about ventilation? Are we thinking about how we make these buildings livable in what is an increasingly extreme set of circumstances, not just about cold and energy efficiency, but ventilation and the health of the occupants through these increasingly hot summers?
So true, actually. I think we're pre-programmed to want to shove as much insulation into houses, and we're not used to this mindset of we might have be really uncomfortable because it's warm. We're pre-programmed to think it's going to be cold and wet, particularly as someone coming from Ireland. I think I'm even more skewed in that direction as well.
Ironically, one of the
Yeah.
other sad and damaging side effects of these very, very hot days is actually, apparently, I forget the actual number, but when we were at 40 degrees last week, PV doesn't work very well. You go above actually the efficiency level of photovoltaic cells. So you have a situation where you think your roof is going to be, producing huge amount of
Making you loads of
electricity, but
money.
actually
Yeah,
you've
yeah.
gone beyond its operating range as well in
Oh
terms of
wow, I didn't
efficiency.
realize that. Yeah, I would have been thinking I'm making hay on this
Yeah.
PV on my on my roof last week. Yeah, it's all these nuances. Like, and I say, we're learning so much, and I think it is one of the things that why I think we love being a climate change focused company is that it's such kind of new territory that you are learning new stuff, and it's all going towards a good impact. We hope, and we hope we can get there in time. I think we've talked a lot about kind of doom and gloom, really, and how like far behind we are and things like that. Is there any kind of fun or nice positive things that developments from your side, from the work that you've been doing at RICS, that you think is exciting?
I think it probably is, the number of initiatives in a positive sense that are going on. Sometimes it does feel a bit like herding cats, to use the English phrase, that there are so many initiatives working in this space. But I think we do need that level of kind of innovation and almost sort of healthy competition in terms of people looking at these issues. So, I
Yeah.
think that there should be a degree of optimism here that the kind of data we've talked about is becoming increasingly available, that helps us make these kind of broad brush prioritization kind of decisions. And dare I say it, we need certain events to perhaps shock certain stakeholders into actually taking action here. And for better or for worse, real estate and property is seen as a financial asset by many people. And whilst you'd hope it would be an altruistic action, I think the impact on value now is waking people up.
Yeah.
So I think that hopefully we will see more focus, more activity, more resource put into it, because actually, for better or for worse, people can see it's hurting their pockets, to use the vernacular, in terms of financial outcomes, both in terms of the cost of power that we're seeing and also the negative effect it's going to have on value of buildings. So it's going to hit people not only from a kind of a social awareness perspective of doing the right thing, but also just it's going to cause financial damage. And I would hope also that from a government perspective, they realise that this is such an existential issue now that there has to be some funding behind it. I mean, I'm not saying we can go to the extreme of the Italian government in terms of the kind of huge incentives they've been offering over the last year or so, which has had a huge number of take up there. But I mean, they've been offering very generous incentives in that kind of residential retrofit arena. but certainly that there has to be a step change. And I think just the weight of activity now, I think, does mean, and it was interesting actually reading The Economist this week, where they were very critical of, from a kind of financial market perspective, the ESG agenda, and their critique really was actually, let's just focus on emissions, sustainability. That their concern was that the capital markets were trying to get lots of measurements right across all the ESG pillars, and really the most critical one now was to focus on really emissions and sustainability, and that the kind of social value and the governance, whilst important, really the critical issue was to get clarity on how firms and assets are performing around that kind of sustainability and emissions piece, and really not muddy the waters with trying to measure so many metrics across this very, very broad ESG agenda, but focus really laser-like on the emissions and the carbon problem.
That's very true. So ESG has it's become this term that the three letters are associated with each other, but really, to a certain degree, social and governance, they're measured in very different ways to carbon, whereas there's less opportunity, if it's done right, for emissions, for the E to be greenwashed, because that should be something that we can measure objectively. And really, they are kind of three very different things. So why they're kind of bundled up together, I guess they're all in a kind of profit for good sense, that in a kind of way that we should be thinking. But yeah, that's really good point, I think, around that I hadn't really thought about before.
Certainly, putting the sort of optimistic glass half full, I think the sheer amount of focus now, the fact that certainly speaking as RICS, we have such focus in terms of our standards work, in terms of upskilling the profession, that there certainly remain huge challenges. But I think increasingly there'll be a number of drivers, carrots and sticks, as we've discussed, that I think will hopefully push this. And as I say, once again, I'm very optimistic that that the social sector, the social housing sector, can take a lead here, drive activity, help that sort of building up of supply chain of skilled trades, because we do need to protect consumers here. We don't need the Wild West. We need to make sure that these kind of retrofit offers that are there, that are financed, that are actually fitted, are done in an efficacious way, not only in terms of producing the desired savings, but actually making sure that people get value for money. So there are some really big sort of societal things we need to be sure about here to make sure this rolls out in a way that people can trust in terms of the advice they get, getting the right kind of options installed for them, for their particular house, given where they live and all those kind of constraints, and that it's done in a professional way and they get good value for money.
Yeah, just to add to your positive note, I read a study from Scottish Power last week that was just published, saying that the average uplift in your property's value as a result of it being at a kind of probably an EPCC, but being more energy efficient property, is about 10 grand. So, and I think that number will only grow as the awareness of the need for properties to be more energy efficient, because it impacts your energy bills so much more, probably three times as much as it used to, that hopefully there is even more carrot incentive there to, and a kind of just a sensible business decision from an ROI on the whole resi consumer side of things. As we know on the commercial side, they're already well aware of that, and the valuations prove that. But in other kind of, hopefully, really, if we see a lot more of those studies coming out, a lot more education around that can only be positive as well.
We were talking there, Orla, about that kind of sense of, you mentioned that research, I think from, I think it might be the WWF sponsored report that came out last week around the link to value and green credentials. And it's an area where I've had lots of conversations over the last few years where people, when they're talking to our valuers, that part of our profession, are obviously very keen to see that link between green credentials and either rental or capital values. And I think the frustration we've had as a profession is that we can only really show that causal link when the market reacts to these signals and places a higher value on these properties. Because if a property has a B, C or A EPC, for example, unless a similar property with a lower rating has a different price, then we can't reflect that. We can't simply value a property higher because it simply has an EPC rating higher. There must be that market behaviour that says actually people are putting value on that. They're either paying less for a less well-performing property, or they're literally giving that green premium, that additional premium for a high-performing property. And as ever, so often this comes back to data. We need the data. We need to know how well properties perform, not just the one that we might want to buy, but the comparable ones. How well are other properties performing in that
Yeah.
space? And as you say, that delta, that difference will increase rather sadly because of the huge increases we've seen in the cost of gas and electricity. But both sides, valuers, consumers, everybody needs to have that data and awareness to make those decisions, because as we know, when you buy a house, you're thinking about schools and south-facing garden and how many bedrooms and how many bathrooms and all those kind of not so much irrational things, but things that fit with people's lifestyle. And certainly EPC and energy consumption is a factor in that, but it's not the only factor. So people need both education and awareness of these data points on sustainability to help them decide, well, yeah, what premium will I pay for that? Will I pay £10,000 more when I get my mortgage, or is it not something that I will actually happily buy another house because of some different criteria? So we need the data, we need that awareness.
Yeah, and really good point as well. And it's that you're comparing like for like with the data as well. Because I guess as well, if you consider, and this is one of the kind of the worries as well with regional disparity, if I'm going to put 10, 15 grand into a property up in, the north of Wales, that's a huge amount of my LTV because property valuations are so much lower. Whereas being able to take an additional drawdown from a bank for 10 to 15 grand on a flat in London that's worth £500,000, very, very different story and situation. So, these are all again, this is why data is so important, but all the different things that we need to look at. But certainly a much more positive development, I think, and hopefully we'll see more of that. And a very positive note to leave this on. So I'm glad there is big challenges, but as I said, I think everybody is very excited to be working on it, and I think the will is there. We're starting to see a lot more investment, so hopefully things can speed up now, and there will be more positive developments over the next 12 to 24 months as well. So, Andrew, thank you so much. It's been such an enjoyable conversation. And yeah, please do keep us posted of any new developments from RICS from your side as well.
Of course I will do. Pleasure.
Thanks, Andrew.